Well, I grew up in a rural area down in southern Kent County, and up the road from us was a chestnut stump that was still intact, and it was about 4 meters across, and it had been cut off at probably about the 2 meter mark. And as young boys growing up in the neighborhood, we had converted it into a fort because it happened to be hollow.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story. I'm your host, Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs. We talk to creative food gardeners and farm and garden experts who break the rules and make new ones too. Today on the show, some history, a sad story, and some hope, and also the promise of an amazing food crop. All this from a tree that was known as the redwood of the East, a towering giant that was prized for its wood, a species that was pivotal to the forest ecosystem. It even fed the brook trout. And by the 1950s, it was thought to be pretty much extinct here in Ontario. But it wasn't extinct, and it's not extinct now. We're heading to southwestern Ontario to hear what the Canadian Chestnut Council is doing to bring the American chestnut back to our landscape. Whether you're a forager, interested in food forests, or want to grow nuts, I think you'll be excited to hear about this. And it's not just limited to southern Ontario. Our chestnut guide today is someone whose fascination with the American chestnut started with a dead chestnut tree. As a kid, he made a fort in this massive chestnut stump. And today, Ron Casier is the chair of the Canadian Chestnut Council. It's a group that includes scientists, conservationists, woodlot owners, students, and retirees from coast to coast in Canada. And you can connect with Ron and the Canadian Chestnut Council at canadianchestnutcouncil.ca. Now, here's our chat with Ron. Ron, thanks for hanging out with us today on the podcast to talk all about the American chestnut. I'm really looking forward to this.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start out by just introducing our listeners to the American chestnut. Because it's been off the radar for so long, I suspect it might be new to a lot of people.
Not too many people have actually seen a living American chestnut. Originally, the tree was extremely common. In Canada here, it would have been 1 out of every 4 hardwoods in the Carolinian zone was an American chestnut. And in the States, you would get as almost 33% were American chestnut. And it was an important tree in the ecosystem. Not only was it a super canopy tree, meaning that it stood above the normal canopy of the forest, it would grow to 35 meters in height, and at the base height diameter, it'd be 4 meters across.
Wow.
So a very, very large tree. The only other tree that might come close to that would be the tulip tree. So the size was very impressive. Of course, it was an important staging area for raptors. They nested in there, and that was also their major hunting platform over top of the forest canopy. The other thing that the American chestnut was, it's recognized as a keystone species. So it was extremely important to the overall food web of the Carolinian forest. The nuts it produces, it's the only tree that produces a crop every year because it flowers very late in the season. Most other nut and mass trees produce crops every 2nd to 5th year. So wildlife was very dependent, and recent studies have shown that up to 80% of the hard mast in the forest was produced by American chestnut. So it fed a lot of different things: white-tailed deer, grouse, passenger pigeon, wild turkey, black bears, field mice, raccoons, skunks, squirrels, chipmunks. Very high in nutrition, so it was an important source of food for them. And of course, that in turn also provided lots of food for the next level of predators. So cougar, bobcat, and the gray fox were also very dependent on organisms that depended upon the chestnut. The other important group were the leaves. About 125 moths and butterfly species depended upon chestnut leaves, and at least 11 of them were obligated and actually became extinct upon the demise of the American chestnut in North America. And all these insects that depended upon the chestnut, of course, were food for the insectivore songbirds. So almost all our songbirds depended upon these insects for their food, and in return, like the goshawk and the Cooper's hawk fed on our songbirds. And so with the demise of the chestnut, again, you have this whole collapse of the food web. And so goshawk and Cooper hawk populations have never quite recovered from that demise. And of course, our songbird populations took a big hit. Also from the leaves are the leaf pack that would fall into streams. Chestnut leaves are higher in protein than most leaves. And so the benthic macroinvertebrates that live in the stream, those are the insects, aquatic insects, they would feed on the chestnut leaves over the year and, of course, grow fairly large, had huge populations. And, of course, in turn, they fed the brook trout. So our native brook trout were dependent upon that. And, again, the demise of the tree caused the loss of those food webs and food chains. And so there is a cascade effect that our ecosystem really hasn't recovered with the loss of the tree.
It sounds like a huge loss, and I'm thinking of the last decade here in southern Ontario as I've watched ash trees disappear from the landscape, and I've thought that was a big deal. But as you described the place that the chestnut held in the ecosystem, it's huge.
Yeah, we probably don't even recognize everything that actually went extinct at the time because, of course, the demise came very rapidly. And not all the ecological services that the chestnut provided were studied at that time. So we're learning new things.
So, Ron, both you and I are from a post-chestnut period. I've never actually seen an American chestnut that I know of, but you've got such an intense interest in them. Tell us about your American chestnut journey. What got you interested in studying this tree?
Well, I grew up in a rural area down in southern Kent County, and up the road from us was a chestnut stump that was still intact, and it was about 4 meters across, and it had been cut off at probably about the 2 meter mark. And as young boys growing up in the neighborhood, we had converted it into a fort because it happened to be hollow. And so that was my first introduction to chestnut. Our area had no living chestnuts that I ever came across in my youth. Growing up on the farm, I had an interest in our woodlot and was interested in ecology and became a science teacher and tried to instill that interest in the ecology. And upon retiring, I joined the Canadian Chestnut Council to see if I could help out.
Maybe we should back up even more now, and let's talk about the blight that came in and made such a drastic change in our landscape. Tell us about the chestnut blight and what it did.
Chestnut blight is endemic to Asia, and it's a fungus that attacks the cambium layer of the tree, and as a byproduct, it produces oxalic acid, which is a white crystalline structure, and it's deposited into the xylem and phloem cells of the tree, of the stem, and they're responsible for moving materials up and down the stem. So what they do is, as the blight spreads, it kills or plugs up all the communication lines between the root and the crown, and the tree dies from starvation and from the lack of water and minerals. In North America here, the American chestnut, just like in Europe, the European chestnut, had no exposure to the blight. And of course, when it was accidentally introduced, the blight was very effective in destroying both species. Here in North America, it was about 1876, 12 Japanese chestnuts were imported from Japan by the first mail-order tree nursery in New Jersey. And they were brought in because they produced much larger nuts than the American chestnut. And so some entrepreneurs had thought, grow bigger nuts, make more money. And we know that they imported more of the infected trees over the next decade or two. It wasn't until 1904 when the chestnuts at the botanical gardens in New York City suddenly died off in one season that the disease was actually recognized. So it's often identified as the start of the blight. But actually the blight had been spread up and down the American seaboard already and was encroaching onto the Appalachians. Here in Canada, the blight appeared at Niagara Falls in about 1925, and by 1926 it had gone across the range and was at Windsor. So it just was a progressive thing. And it basically, in North America, it probably eliminated about 4.5 to 5 billion trees.
Wow.
Here in southern Ontario was probably 1.5 to 2 million trees died. And for a long time, they thought the tree was completely extinct here in Ontario. But from our surveys and people reporting the tree, we have about 1,800 trees that are recognized as being survivors in the wild here in southern Ontario.
Let's talk about those survivors. So you had talked about these 35-meter trees 4 feet across. I think that's not what the survivors look like. Is that right?
No. The only specimen that is that large yet is in the southern part of Maine, tucked up on a mountain slope somewhere. And it was rediscovered about 6 years ago. Here in southern Ontario, a lot of our trees are about anywhere from 15 to 20 inches across at the base height diameter. And they're averaging maybe 80, 85 feet. So there's a fair collection of those. Now, there are many more smaller ones that are trapped under the canopy. We find that canopy suppression is one of the problems with the surviving chestnuts. And unfortunately, in our last survey, which was in 2014, we only found 7 recruits, which are young seedlings that are coming up from seed in the wild. So without our help, the chestnut would certainly suffer extinction without some of our input or interfering with trying to save the species.
Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about that now and the work of the Chestnut Council, because there's some exciting breeding work going on to come up with chestnuts that are resistant to this disease. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we actually have 2 breeding programs. One involves our 26 what we call native families. They're some of the trees that we've collected material from. And we're breeding them against pollen that we brought back from, or that was donated by the Connecticut Research Farm. So it's a hybrid tree. The trees from Connecticut had European, Chinese, and Korean chestnut material in it. The idea was to breed an American chestnut by back-crossing it to our own trees with the fact that we'd get to a tree that was 97-98% American, and the remaining percentage would be the resistant genes that we know that we can find in the Chinese and other foreign chestnuts. So that's one of the breeding programs. The more exciting breeding program that has evolved is using our own native chestnuts. We discovered that there was a native resistance to the blight, not exceptionally strong, but it was there. And so what we've been doing is back-crossing our own trees that we find in Ontario here with each other, selecting for the best traits, and then we are just starting to produce our third generation of back crosses. And we believe we are concentrating the native resistance. We seem to have an improvement from the first to the second generation. And now the third generation, which we're planting out, we're anticipating it to be highly resistant to the blight. And of course, by the end of this decade, we should have our first F4 crosses, and we're anticipating that they will be very highly tolerant to the blight, if not resistant to the blight. That's where our breeding program is. Just takes a long time to breed trees using traditional breeding techniques.
Coming up, find out why American chestnuts here in Ontario are Canadian. Ron explains how they're different from their Appalachian cousins. That's coming up in just a moment. Shout out today to Nancy, who got in touch about growing figs. And Nancy, I hope you get a great harvest. I pointed Nancy towards our fig growing articles and interviews at foodgardenlife.com. There's lots of information there for all of you would-be cold climate fig growers. And to Heidi, who's growing lemons, I hope you get fruit this year. Heidi has seed-grown lemons, but with seed-grown plants, it can be a few years before you get fruit. The fastest way to get your own lemons is to get a plant that's grafted or is a rooted cutting. Then it's a clone of a mature plant and it can fruit right away. Hi to Jim, who wrote in to ask what Emma's favorite tomato variety is. Emma's response, and I was interested to hear this too, Jim, the favorite cherry tomato is Rosella, and the favorite beefsteak is Paul Robeson. And also a hi to Harry. Harry made a very cool pallet garden with vertical pallets and a structure that can be cloaked in plastic. As he said, pallets are often free. Thanks, Harry. Love the idea. Thanks all of you for being part of our food gardening gang. And speaking of what a great gang of listeners all of you are, would you do us a favor? Help us figure out what to give you more of. There's a link to a survey in the show notes. Take our 2-minute survey to be entered into a draw for free 30-minute virtual garden consultation. And one more shout out to our Toronto listeners. For Earth Day 2023, there's a fundraiser in support of Toronto urban growers. It's a great group that's focused on urban agriculture and food security. And for the fundraiser, they're screening a film that I think will excite all gardeners. It's called Kiss the Ground, and it digs into regenerating the world's soils and talks about the role of soils in stabilizing climate. Find out more at kisstheground.eventbrite.ca. New articles on foodgardenlife.com this week to help you grow more of your own food. 7 vegetable garden layout ideas to grow more food in your garden. And we dig into things like spacing and the difference between rows and growing in blocks. And also an article on how to grow Saskatoon berries, the prairie berry. And for American listeners, you might know that as the June berry. Both of those at foodgardenlife.com. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that brings together gardening, food, and the human story, with your hosts Emma Biggs and me, Stephen Biggs. Now, back to our chat with Ron Casier. I wanted to zoom in on one thing that I find very interesting is that you're focused on the Canadian American chestnut. What does that mean?
Well, recent DNA analysis has shown that our population of chestnuts here in Ontario, what we call Canadian population, has a very distinct and unique genetic set of genes. Very distinct from the American chestnuts you find in the neighboring states. It's very distinct from the trees you'd find in the Appalachia or the coastal trees as like you'd find in Connecticut. In fact, the closest living relative to our population is found in southeast Georgia.
Wow.
And so one of the key things now that we're interested in is preserving our unique genetic population. Analysis from our surveys and all our DNA, our population is really pure and homogeneous. The last couple of rounds of rechecking all the DNA analysis, we've removed initially 13 trees and more recently 4 more trees. So 17 trees in total were removed from our breeding program because they proved not to be originally from a Canadian stock. So they were probably brought here by early settlers or First Nations. So our population, which is now referred to as the Northwest population, of course, is evolved to our climate, our weather conditions, and we know it will migrate much farther north. We have mature, viable trees producing nuts at North Bay and at Sault Ste. Marie.
Wow.
So we know it will go much farther than the original range. And we've started planting colonies outside the traditional range of the tree.
North Bay and Sault Ste. Marie, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's so they appear to be very cold hardy, so it's a great tree to migrate north with climate change.
And in terms of the original range, where they were found in Ontario, would they have come up as far as where I am here in Toronto?
Basically, they follow the north shore of Lake Erie, and then roughly a line from Goderich on Lake Huron to Oakville on Lake Ontario.
Okay.
So that's roughly the range. It paralleled very similar to what we consider the Carolinian zone.
So for people who are interested in this idea of maybe looking for some of those survivors, that would be the area where they would go look then?
Yes, that would be an area. Now you'll find their in modern times, people have carried the tree farther north. So you may find trees growing up on the Bruce Peninsula or along the Niagara Escarpment. The wild trees will be below that line. But you may find planet trees that have been moved. We get reports of various trees in the various watersheds of the Toronto area as well. And we always appreciate people reporting those using our website. Even if it's a tree we know about, we appreciate it because I had mentioned our survey. We're coming up on our next survey is in 2024. And so if we do know of newly discovered trees, we'll try to incorporate those into the survey and have their DNA tested to see where they fit in with the preservation of the species.
And I'm glad you mentioned the survey because I was thinking for listeners who are excited about this idea of the American chestnut work that you're doing, how do people get involved with your organization?
Well, again, on the website, there's a membership, and membership is open to anyone that's interested in the tree. We also, as a volunteer group, we're always looking for volunteers. Most recently, we planted 6,500 nuts in the greenhouses at the Simcoe Research Station. Fortunately, we did it in 2.5 days because we had a mob of people, actually a waiting list of people to help volunteer. But we greatly appreciate that. And of course, various times in planting and doing measurements for inoculation and that sort of thing, we need people to come out and help our head scientists and other members that are covering the research.
And I'm guessing that those nuts are pretty precious, that there's not a lot of snacking that goes on there. But have you read about what this American chestnut tastes like compared to other chestnuts that people might be familiar with?
Well, having eaten some American chestnuts has a very strong, I shouldn't say strong taste, but a very strong, flavorful taste. In my opinion, much better than any European or Chinese, which of course are a larger nut. People have to remember that the American chestnut was a small nut because it had to be able to fit down the gullet of a bird. So it evolved for wildlife. So they're a little more work, but the taste is great. The other neat thing with the chestnut, it's the only nut that it has no known allergic reaction, and that's because it has no oils in it. So the chestnut never really goes rancid. So like from what we learned from First Nations is that they would keep chestnuts whole for up to 2 years. And by that time, the nut's gotten very hard. You can peel it and you soak it in water. It becomes edible again. But what they would do is grind it into flour, put it in a leather satchel, hang it in the rafters of the longhouse where the smoke kept the insects out, and it would stay good up to 5 to 6 years. And so chestnuts were an important food supply, not only for humans. Of course, roasting chestnuts on the open fire was a very popular thing, but people used chestnut in their diet, put it into stews, could make bread out of it. There was all sorts of use for it. And anything you had extra, you fed to your pigs. And historical records show that the Chicago market used to give a premium for hogs that were fed on chestnut because when the hams were cured, gave it a very distinct taste. There was a whole economy based around the nut itself. And of course, the lumber, chestnut is very straight-grained, easy to work with, has the same strength as oak, but is much lighter and more workable. And probably the best thing about it is that it was almost completely rot resistant. Everything was made from chestnut wood. It was called the cradle to grave tree because your cradle and your coffin were both made of chestnut, and everything in between that you used that was made of wood was chestnut. So furniture, houses, barns, fence posts, eventually telegraph poles, hydro poles, telephone poles, even railroad ties, musical instruments. And so our museums are full of wooden artifacts because of the fact that chestnut wood is very good at preserving itself and therefore anything that it's made from.
This is really exciting. And you started out in our chat talking about it as being a keystone species, truly a versatile and a wonderful tree if we can get that back into the ecosystem.
Yeah, it has an important cultural aspect that we've lost. And actually, we're working with First Nations to provide them with chestnut trees to help restore part of their cultural practices. And the economic spin-offs, again, with the loss of a lot of our hardwoods due to various invasive species and diseases, restoring the chestnut back to our woodlots would provide another economic value to maintaining woodlots for lumber. Chestnut grows fairly fast. In about 50 years, you can have marketable trees. Now, of course, if you want to grow an 11.5-story tall chestnut, that's going to take a couple centuries.
Ron, thanks so much for telling us all about the chestnut and about the Canadian Chestnut Council. I will include in the show notes and the blog post for this episode the web address so people can connect. I should also mention, too, that you shared with me photos of what those leaves look like. So for listeners who are excited to go out and look for American chestnuts, you'll have something to start with. So, Ron, thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk about American chestnut.
That was our chat with Ron Casier, chair of the Canadian Chestnut Council. You can connect with Ron and the Canadian Chestnut Council at canadianchestnutcouncil.ca. Are you wondering what American chestnut trees look like? Ron shared some pictures that I've included with the blog post for this episode, and you can find that at foodgardenlife.com. What did you think? As Ron talked about how this keystone species fed so many things in the ecosystem, I was thinking about what a staggering loss it was. 1 out of every 4 hardwoods here in the Carolinian zone of Ontario. Wow. Something else that really jumped out at me was that these trees are hardy in colder zones, places like North Bay and Sault Ste. Marie where I wouldn't expect a chestnut tree to grow. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm remembering the American elms of my childhood here in the Toronto neighborhood of Willowdale. In the 1970s, there were still a few around. Really big trees. Dad talked about how, when there had been more, going along the street was a little bit like being in a tunnel because the umbrella-like canopies from these big elm trees on both sides of the street joined over the top of the street. They're all gone now, save for one. There's one right across from the home I grew up in, a gorgeous elm tree. And I wonder, is it just luck? Or does that tree have some resistance? And I don't know. The podcast is back next Thursday, but before that, don't forget that next week's show starts off on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time as our live radio show. It's on realityradio101.com, and when you tune in live, you can send in your questions. We have a great show lined up. We're heading to Quebec to find out about a polyculture orchard, and then we go to Vermont for some super fun ideas for gardening with kids. Got to get those kids into the mud. We'd love it if you drop by to say hi online at foodgardenlife.com. We have articles about growing fruit, veg, using your homegrown produce, also about growing figs and lemons in cold climates. So say hi. Tell us the topics that would help you grow more of your own. And you'll also get to see the faces that go with these voices that you hear on the podcast. While you're at foodgardenlife.com, also grab our free newsletter. Subscribers get the subscriber-only cold climate fig guide and small space food gardening tip sheet.
And you can find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca, and on Instagram as emmabiggs_grows.
If you've listened this far into the show, thank you. An easy way to support our show is to leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, and that's because it's a chance to tell us what you love about the show, but it also helps other people to discover it. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.